Hello, friends. Just a personal note before we get to today's interview. Just prior to releasing this episode with Scott Kloos, we found out that his wife, Catherine, was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and is currently undergoing treatment. Of course, this is tragic news and will be a real financial hardship for her and her family. So, if you're at all touched or inspired by Scott's story and his work as a herbalist and alternative health care provider, please consider donating to their GoFundMe. I'll include a link in the description below. Thanks so much. Oh, I forgot to ask you, what's the proper pronunciation of your last name?
Close.
Close. Okay, I was gonna say Kloos,
Yeah,
but
everybody says close. It's Dutch, so it's got that long O.
well, Scott Kloos,
Close.
welcome to the podcast. See, I did it. Okay, I'm gonna do it again. I'm looking at it. That's the problem.
It's not far. It's close.
Scott Close, welcome to the podcast, man. It's great to see you.
Yeah, likewise. I really appreciate you inviting me here.
My pleasure. Just give people a bit of a background. We met many years ago when I was working in the Santo Daime and traveling down to the States where it was legal. And I had a really interesting experience of you. I think you were working as a guardian in one of the bigger works that I was down there for. And at some point, this guardian comes walking by, and the way I remember it is he had like a utility belt like Batman, but it was full of like essential oils or herbal essences. And maybe you sensed that I was getting caught up in some like kind of heavy energy or something, and you offered, I think it was rosemary, and I held up my hands and you sprinkled a bit on my palms, and I remember taking just a big whiff of it, and it just completely cleared everything that was getting cloudy in my head. And I was like, "Oh, thanks." Like it was just so cool the way you kind of came by, sent something, offered a little something, and it just opened up the experience in a really nice way. So that's how I remember meeting you.
Oh, that's great. I think maybe there was some altering of your perception and seeing the utility belt and all that. It wouldn't have been rosemary. It would have been some kind of a tincture, a botanical extract. And I work almost exclusively with the bioregional plants that grow around here. So it would have been probably. I'm wondering if it was Devil's Club, because that's one that I usually carry around with me in ceremony. It's a
Uh,
really potent, clear, yeah.
It's got a similar kind of smell to it, or that kind of mentholated effect.
Yeah, it's very aromatic and um, yeah, clarifying through its essential oils that are in it.
Hmm. Well, I have Devil's Club on my list of things to talk to you about because it seems like that's a really kind of primary plant ally for you. But I think we'll get there. Just it'd be helpful maybe to have a little bit of background, and I'm always interested to hear in how people got started on their path, whatever it might be. So I'm wondering, like, did you grow up in the Pacific Northwest?
I did not. I was born in Hollywood, of all places. And then,
Really?
yeah, yeah. And then when I was 4, my parents moved us out to kind of the outskirts of LA into a semi-rural zone where they could afford a house. And so I spent my most of my childhood running around in the, you know, oak savanna hills of this area, but the mindset there was still very much LA, and I never felt like I belonged at all. But then when the first time I came, the reason I came to Oregon the first time was I was in college and I was hanging out with a friend and we were watching David Letterman, and Ken Kesey came on, and we
Really?
found out, oh, he lives in Oregon. Oh, let's go to Ken Kesey's place. So we, drove up, started driving the next day, and we never found Ken Kesey's place. But literally as soon as I crossed the border, I had this feeling that I really never felt in my life. I felt, oh, I feel home here. I didn't know what it was. It was actually kind of a strange feeling at first. It took me a while to get the interpretation of, oh, this is home. And it took me, several years after that to get up here, but I've been here since the early to mid 90s. So better part of
Mm.
my life.
So that adventure to go find Ken Kesey, how old were you then?
I was probably about 19 or 20.
Yeah, I think it's about the age for those of us who grew up in the 80s, start reading all the beats, and then
Yep.
the beats lead you to the kind of I don't know, what would you call those guys? Like the kind of I think of them kind of as more modern transcendentalists in a way, like really connected to nature, influenced by Zen Buddhism. And of course, drugs was a part of their opening, I guess.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and like Gary Snyder and those kind of guys, you know.
Exactly. Yeah. I remember I was super, me and my friends were super into Kerouac and on the road.
Hmm.
I had remembered being like really deeply influenced by him. But when I went back and read his stuff, just a handful of years back, I was like, it doesn't really touch me. It's books for, young people. But then I like last year I read an anthology of um, poets, nature poets influenced by Chinese poetry. And I got to the Gary Snyder section and went, oh, this is who inspired me from that time and like still, really resonates. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, his stuff doesn't get old in the same way as like for me, Kerouac or Burroughs, or I mean Bukowski kind of like I go through phases with Bukowski. Like he had such a kind of a dark life, but he
Yeah.
was kind of like a bit of a like a crazy wisdom Zen master in his own way, you know?
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
beautiful stuff. Like he really connected to beauty in life, that didn't exclude the darkness and the grime and the muck.
Yeah. I haven't tapped into him for a while, but he used to be a guiding force of mine for sure. That I love
Mm,
the rawness and the darkness and like you said, like yeah, there was such beauty that could come through just these little moments and yeah, a real teacher of how to pay attention.
hmm.
Yeah.
And like a model for just being yourself too, like
Mhm.
just being completely honest.
Mhm.
Like he did not give two shits what people thought of him.
No. No.
And the older I get, the more inspired I am by that, I think,
Yeah. Me too.
Uh, so when did you wake up to the kind of the magical world of plants and plants as healers? When did that happen for you?
I started I started learning about herbal medicine when I moved to Oregon, and I had a girlfriend at the time who was really started getting into plants, and she started working for a herbal medicine making company, and so we were learning together. And I had the impulse to become a farmer. I wanted to be a farmer, live out on the land, grow herbs, and so I did an apprenticeship at this place called Herb Farm down in Southern Oregon. That's like one of the bigger herbal extract companies these days. And but they came out of that whole like kind of like hippie movement and they connected with the land. So it started out as a small thing and became a big thing, but it was still when I was there, maybe it's probably still like that. I think just really connected in that way. And as part of our apprenticeship program, we worked on the farm during the day, and then we'd have classes in the evenings and classes on the weekends. And there was
Mm.
um, this woman named Deborah Francis, also goes by Dancing Crow, and I'm still friends with her. And she was the first person that said, I think it was Hawthorne, and she just passed. We had our class. She passed out these Hawthorne berries and had everyone taste it and just sit quietly and see what happened. And I didn't know anything about Hawthorne, and most of the people in the room didn't know anything about Hawthorne at the time. And then we meditated with it for 5 or 10 minutes, and then she invited us to share. And through everybody sharing, and I had experiences, feelings that came up, and I described them, and she, Deborah Francis, uh, affirmed that what we were experiencing was indeed what the medicinal properties and other factors that these plants can bring were real. So I really got excited about that. And not long after that, I was back in the city and struggling with, being a city person living in Portland. And I looked back in my notes from that time and saw, in big letters on a bunch of the pages, sit with the plants, sit with the plants, sit with the plants. So I packed up my camping gear and headed out, over the Cascade Mountains into the eastern part of the state. Spent about 2 weeks out there, doing nothing but finding finding different plants, finding where they grew, being with them, ingesting them. And one of the ones that I had a really profound experience with was juniper.
Mm,
That's become one of my like foundational allies of my life.
mm,
Has helped me, move through, pretty intensely uh, held experiences of trauma from my childhood of being, I was someone who was sexually abused, and this plant juniper has helped me come to a place of acceptance of that. Not that it was okay that that happened, but that it happened.
it happened. Yeah.
It happened, and there's nothing I can do to change that. So how do I, like the juniper tree, find the twists and turns that my body,
Mm,
my inner being has done to accommodate the, the effect of that intensity so that I can then have this beautiful shape that I can share with the world. And that's what you see in the juniper trees. So
mm,
yeah,
mhm,
so the original experience, all that came way after. The original experience was just this like really intense sensation of something I couldn't understand. And I'm glad that at that time I didn't try really hard to make sense of it, because back then I was more
mm,
into that. And I've learned
mhm.
since that there's a whole way of being with the world that, is more foundational than what comes through our rational analytical minds. And I know you're a Hillman guy, right? I've listened to you heard you talk about Hillman on your
Oh
podcast.
yeah. Yeah. You too?
Oh yeah, yeah. I learned so much from him about working with dreams. He
Hmm.
talks about how if we take this thing from the night world and then wrestle it into day world consciousness, we're just like emasculating it and like putting it in this little box. But rather than doing that, just to like be with the image of the dream. And that's, really how I work with plants too, is to be, people expect, if you're trying to get, learn from a plant, that it's gonna, you know, oh, there's gonna be this little plant person that's going to talk to you and tell you all the things you need to know. And sometimes that actually does happen.
Depends on what kind of plants you had
Yeah,
before. You
yeah. But mostly it's these sensations that go, um, to like wh- I'm hesitant to talk about. Are you familiar with Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy?
A little bit. I never got much into the philosophers, but yeah.
Yeah, he's like a process relational philosopher. I think he's kind of one of the people that kind of really popularized that. He was working at the same time as like quantum physics was coming through. And I don't want to talk about him too much because I'm in the middle of this deep study of his work and
Mm,
haven't fully digested it. But he talks about like our modes of perception, that we think of like consciousness as these sort of like everyday thing and it's there, but he's saying that most everything that we're experiencing is below all of that. And I feel like when we work with plants in this way, especially when we work with, more overtly psychoactive plants, it takes us into, um, allows us to be more in relationship with those deeper layers of sensory perception.
hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we have this bias because of Western culture and rationalism that consciousness, the only perceptive organ of consciousness is up in the head.
Yeah.
It comes through the eyes or the ears or the nose and gets processed by the brain, and everything happens up here. But through whatever practices we're doing, a yoga practice or working with plants, we realize that the whole body is a bunch of sensory organs of perception, of consciousness. Like behind the senses is consciousness, and has its own way of processing experience and making sense of experience on a kind of a sub-linguistic level that is just as valid as how we try to make sense of things using words in our mind and using frameworks and concepts. And I think, for me, that's a big part of what I call like decolonizing the mind
Mm,
is attuning to these other ways of experiencing and being and understanding and making sense of the world. Like I did a podcast with this guy, John Vervaeke,
mm,
a few years ago, right as he was starting to get really popular. And, he's talking about consciousness and um, he's kind of a big mind guy, philosophy type guy, and I'm talking to him going, but when I do like my yoga practice, it feels meaningful to me. And I can't verbalize why it feels meaningful. I'm like, so what is that? That seems to me to be meaning, like another form of meaning
mm.
making or meaning being. And he couldn't quite explain it either, but he got what I was talking about because I think he's a Tai Chi practitioner. And we were just at this moment where, like, all of his concepts and everything, there was no words to describe what we were trying to talk about. And I thought that was a really interesting moment because it kind of broke his ability to, speak in like long paragraphs and everything. And we were just kind of like, yeah, but when I do Tai Chi or when I do yoga, it feels meaningful.
Yeah,
And that's an important realization, I think, in terms of like having a fuller experience of life.
right. Yeah, and then it's no wonder that if we're approaching the world just from that kind of rational mental way, then we would perceive the universe as like a mechanical and lifeless and dead. But as soon as we enter into that relationship with our full beings, it's like the whole world just comes
Hmm.
alive. Yeah.
So you started to have these kind of like uh, intuitive interactions, meetings with different plants. And I like how you said that it wasn't like the experience wasn't kind of mediated or obscured or clouded by a bunch of concepts and like plant monographs that you'd memorized, and you go seeking out the qualities of the
Yeah.
plant, but you
Yep.
just have the experience. And like what a great experience of that teacher to start with each person's experience. Like Hillman talks about that as a higher form of education, about
Mhm.
education, the root of it being about drawing out something from the student rather than stuffing something in.
Totally.
She got that.
Yeah. Yeah, I learned so much about plants from what I did after I had those initial experiences. I thought, oh, I need to like really do a deep study of what these plants are trying to show me because I wanted to make sense of it on some level. And so I gathered some friends and we started doing tastings with the plants, meditations. I call them plant teacher circles. I would do it where I wouldn't tell people what we were going to take. And then we'd take it and we'd sit and then we'd share. And then, I mean, I learned so much because then I'd hear, I'd have my experience, but the experience I'm having is, filtered through my own system. It's the plant sort of speaking through me. But then if there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 20 people that are having their own experiences, and then as everyone shares, it's almost like I envision it sometimes as there's like the plant is, hovering around us, the archetypal being of the plant, and then is just weaving these threads through each person's story and sharing to create a tapestry that, shows us, oh, this is who I am. And, it's so easy for people to, when they're learning about plants, to be like, oh, what's that good for? Oh, what can this do for me?
Yeah.
And that's such a limiting form, and it's also, a very human centric way. But when we approach the plants from this other way, the the things that come through are incredible. I can think back to there was a moment where my work with the plants shifted to some degree. And I remember I was doing I was giving a talk at some gathering, and I had passed around a tincture of, I think it was red cedar, and started singing. And I give people the tincture to taste, and sing the song that calls the vibration of the plant's medicine. And we're sitting there in meditation. All of a sudden, I start hearing like sobbing, and I look, and there's like a couple people that are crying, and then people are their bodies are shaking because the medicine of the plant is, moving through them so strongly. And that's something, you can't, once you have an experience like that with a plant, you can't forget it. You're not trying to memorize, oh, this plant's good for this.
Mm,
But red cedar is really one of its main attributes that I found is like it really inspires us to be embodied and to be in this relationship with the vibratory frequencies of all the life that's around us, and how to like be, you know, rooted and grounded enough that we can receive that without getting overwhelmed by all of that, all the stuff that's going on in the life around us.
yeah. Oh, that's so great. Like we're surrounded by cedar where
Mm,
I live, and uh, by observing cedar, I've kind of like learned that lesson from it. Because like when we're right by the ocean here, and so when we have really high winds, the cedars, the amount that they can sway and bend
mm,
with the wind without breaking is astounding. And like these super tall trees, with this very delicate foliage, and they're just swaying and rocking, and they're the ones that don't come down. It's all the maples and the oaks that come crashing down, and cedar. So yeah, cedar like kind of teaches me how to like dance with um the tumult, the heavy winds and rains, and to weather it with kind of flexibility, and a flexibility that's really rooted. That's a big part of it too. Like the deeper the roots, the wider spread the roots, um, the more you can flex and roll with it, you know.
yeah, yeah. And they're they don't have deep roots. If you've ever seen one
Mm.
that's fallen over, they're really shallowly on the surface.
Oh yeah, we're
And-
on an island. It's just like a rock. So yeah,
yeah,
there's no deep roots here. Yeah.
yeah. So the way they do it is they their roots spread and they intertwine with the roots of the other trees. So they're actually all helping
Oh.
each other hold up. So there's also this, real deep teaching of community and
Hmm.
allowing ourselves to be held as we're getting buffeted by the winds of life, so
Hmm.
that we're not alone in that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know that they kind of intertwined their roots with others. That's great. So did you then started to do some like I guess more rigorous study to become a licensed herbalist? Is that right?
Well, there really isn't a licensing for being an herbalist.
Hmm.
Um, there's some professional groups that you can get, certified by like
Yeah.
the um, American Herbalist Guild. But I tried, I tried to be a real herbalist for a long time. What I
Hmm.
thought was like a real herbalist, which is like someone that people come to you and you take their case and then give them some herbs that will help them. But I found that the plants didn't want, that's not what they wanted from me. They wanted me to be working in these more archetypal, psychospiritual realms. So people would come to me and, oh, I have a sore throat. Okay, let's be with that. And then, 10 minutes into the session, they're crying and going into this like deep emotional process about what's the throat thing is showing. So thankfully at some point I just gave up the idea of like what I thought an herbalist was, and then realized, oh, plant people that work with plants come in every kind of form. And that's why for me, like when I'm teaching about plants, I I don't want to be like, oh, here's how you be an herbalist like me. So my whole teaching style is like how like how you're describing of it's creating the space where each person can find their way guided by the plants.
Mm.
And it's it's way more fun for me than trying to like produce a bunch of clones of myself. I know there's some forms of education where that's the goal. Like there's like a
Mhm.
person that figured something out, and then everyone wants to learn how to do it like them. And I'm happy to say I've never produced any clones of myself.
A good sign.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I can relate. Every time I've tried to go toward like a more conventional path, I always run into inner and outer obstacles. And it's taken me a long time. I'm not even sure I've fully accepted it yet, because sometimes I still go, maybe I should get that certification that
yeah,
would allow me to have the accreditation, and then people could use their insurance to come see me. Professionally, it would be a good move. But then every time I explore the conventional path of attaining the credentials, I just like something in my heart just kind of closes up. I go,
yeah,
it's not what I'm here for. And I may not be taking the easiest path, to financial success, but it's being true to who I am, I think, and what how Psyche wants to use me in the world. So I don't know. How were you kind of just forced to accept that, or was there something that helped you just accept who you're meant to be and how the plants wanted to work with you?
you know, this you just sparked a memory of being, I'd been teaching for I'd been teaching for a period of time, and like I helped start a herbalist training program, a school for training herbalists, and did that for some years, and was continuing to do these plant teacher circles. And then, I think a big thing that shifted for me was when I started working in the Santo Daime, and it it took what was already happening with me and helped clear the pathways for me to more fully allow those things to move through me. And I remember this is not in the context of the daime, but in the context of I create as I was doing these plant teacher circles, the plants, while we'd be in meditation, people are meditating with a plant, the plants would come to me and say, you need to do this in a different way. You need to take people out into the forest and out into the desert and
Mhm.
out there and like really be in these places. So I don't know. When I think back, I had no, I feel like I had little capacity to do what I was being asked to do, but I couldn't say no to them. So I created this year-long program. And I remember there was this one of the people that had been working with me for a while. When I told her about it, she was like, is this the kind of thing where I'm gonna have to like quit my job and just do this full time? And I was like, we're not quite there yet, but someday maybe. And so it was more like, we'd meet once a month and go out for like a trip for like 5 to 8 days. And on one of it was like the third or fourth trip, and I was just cry every time I brought this group out, I came back feeling like my whole being was crushed because I was just getting wrenched by, the forces of initiation that were
Mm.
helping me to become who I'm still becoming. And I went to the dogwood tree that we were working with that weekend and just sat there just feeling, oh, I have no idea what I'm doing. Why did I say I would do this? This is a disaster. and this message came of like, you this isn't about you. And yes, you have to there was this call to me before that of like taking on a persona, which I was really against. And the message that came when I sat with the dog was, it's not about you taking on a persona, but you have to allow yourself to be oriented so that we can come through you and people have a way to connect with the plants in a different way. And it still took me years, I think, to get to that point. And that was, through Santo Daime, which I've talked about a few times, but I haven't really mentioned that it's a syncretic ayahuasca religion from Brazil.
Mm.
Um, and so in working in that tradition and just like the deep purging and the shaking and the clearing out of the cultural conditioning so that I could really feel and experience the beingness of the plants in a different way. I've been able to do that. And one of the someone someone shared shared with me a couple of years back. She said, I can't remember what we were talking about. She said, when people come and ask me why I like to study with you, I say it because he doesn't talk about the plants. He becomes the plant.
Mm.
And that's kind of like what the plants have trained me to do, is to really adopt their posturing, their archetypal posturing, their energetic. It's hard to describe because it's like it's not coming through this rational way. It's this more embodied, sub-perceptual way. Um, so that's
Mhm.
that's where I got my accreditation from, was from the forest and
Mm.
from just going and working and working and working and working with the plants. And I did have one moment where I felt like I was acknowledged for it in a different way, where I went to Peru to do a dieta at one of the centers in 2013 at the behest of the plants, who wanted to like um, help bring more awareness to how people can make these deep studies with plants. And while I was there, I was walking with one of the main uh, facilitator, like a Shipibo shaman guy, and we were walking to his hut, and he said, he just turned to me and he said, "Oh, I feel iboga on you." And I said, "Well, how do you what? How do you know about iboga?" He said, "Oh, some guy was here a couple months ago and worked with that plant, and I felt it, and I feel it on you." And I was like, "Huh, that's cool." I said, "Do you feel anything else?" He's like, "Oh, you're filled with plants." And so, like, the Shipibo are the masters of, working with plant teachers. I thought, oh, that's cool. I haven't done like their style, but I've done my own study, learned by working with the plants themselves. And that felt good to have that kind of acknowledgement from
So
someone
yeah, it's like a
outside.
recognition.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very cool. So at that point, had you worked with the Boga? Or
Yeah.
was he, was it, I thought maybe it was like a premonition. He's like, there's
No.
something about the Iboga pattern or imprint in you,
Yeah. No, I
you had.
actually started working with Iboga before I came to the Daime. A friend of mine came to Portland with having worked with that medicine in Mexico to do an addiction treatment,
Mm.
and then stayed at the place he worked, learned how to work with it, came to Portland and knew he was going to find some uh, herbalist plant guy that was going to help him work. And then we connected and then started. Um, at that time, we were working in the underground and we started our own exploration of how do we work with this plant, because the way that the way he did it was he was in a hospital bed
Right. Using
with like
IVs and
EKG monitors on him, and it was very strange. So we
mhm.
figured out different ways, and then I helped him start a clinic in Mexico. So I had some deep experiences with that plant prior to that.
Mhm. Um, when you're talking about like opening up to, finding your own way as a plant, what do we call that role if we're not going to say like herbalista or something? Like how do you say it? Are you like a plant healer or plant worker? What's on your business
Oh,
card? I mean, I
plants.
know you've got a lot of things like wildcraft or
Yeah,
ceremonialist, all that kind
yeah,
of thing.
yeah.
But if you were to just give it like succinctly, a plant man?
Plant medicine practitioner, maybe. I don't know. That's a little
Okay.
clunky, but plant person.
Plant medicine practitioner. Yeah. Doesn't quite have the ring as like curandero or shaman.
Yeah.
Damn, we got to do better in English to,
Yeah.
not be appropriative, but find our own style with it. Um, So you mentioned like at the one outing that you were leading, you felt it was a disaster. And I got curious, like, did you feel like it was a disaster in terms of the kind of interpersonal stuff, like being a facilitator and quote unquote teacher, or was it about like something more to do with your direct relationship with the plants? Because I can imagine, I mean, for myself, some of the hardest things I've had to go through is stepping up and being a facilitator and kind of dealing with people and learning how to be with people. Um, yeah, so I'm wondering, like the disaster part, was it more interpersonal or interplant?
Yeah. Things with the plants went well. There was the interpersonal stuff. I was at that time, I didn't know how to not be energetically involved with everybody's process.
Mm,
So everything that was coming up for people, um, yeah, that's a great question because, like when I look back now, I've through my work with the plants, I've learned to not get energetically entwined with everybody's little thing, and so that then creates the space for everyone to be in relationship to their own process. But back then, if somebody was the experience wasn't the way they wanted it to be. I took that as a personal failing of mine and got like wrenched by it. Or if, you know, yeah, whatever, I didn't give the right directions and they got lost and then they were upset with me and oh no, oh. So it was it was that part and then it was just it was really a true initiation and the the pressure that was being applied to me at that time was so intense, so intense. And I love intensity. I'm a Scorpio, so I crave that kind of
oh
like
yeah.
intensity in the darkness. Just one of the reasons I, like working with plant medicine so much.
Mm,
And it's happening in all different phases of my life. I was, and I was, these medicine paths with Iboga and with the Daime, and they were shaking me and stripping me, and it was just an intense time. So it was interpersonal and it was initiatory. That was part of it too, was because it was through that pressure it was bringing me to have to face all of the stuff inside of myself that I didn't like, and I had to accept those aspects of me, and so that they could be shifted into something different.
mm, mhm. Yeah. Um, when you mentioned like that you were being asked to put on a persona, and we have a lot of associations with persona, I think, especially in spiritual communities. Like persona, it's a mask, it's bad. We want to be vulnerable, open, authentic. But Carl Jung spoke to the need to have a persona when you're dealing with the public or with people. The persona as a kind of energetic protection to protect you from projection
Mm. Uh-huh.
and energy loss and things like that. And so he was like, and Michael Mead, I talked to him about this too, because he's done a lot of public presenting, and he's had to learn that as well. And he talked to me about how it's like you can put on the persona while you're on stage, but you have to have a little ritual afterwards to take the persona off
Yeah.
and to re-humble yourself so you don't go
Yeah.
out into the world with this inflated sense of yourself,
Yeah.
filled with all the mana and energy from all the good projections.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So, and then is it like a matter of like finding your unique persona, in a way when working with people and teaching and things like that?
Yeah.
Or is it
Yeah. I
like an
like
attitude or a vibe that all of a sudden like, okay, I'm in teaching mode. Like I feel that when I'm going to do a circle. On the way to the circle, something in me starts to shift. And
yeah.
when I show up, I'm not who I am when I'm at home with my wife. I'm someone different because I'm showing up for work or something, and it kind of like takes over and gives me a different vibe.
Totally, totally, yeah. Yeah, I love that what you shared about Carl Jung talking about like that the persona like protects you from the projection. Because that's exactly what I was describing. Yeah.
Mm,
It is definitely in some ways it's an intensification of who I am.
mm,
It's not
mhm,
it's not something that's coming from outside, but it's definitely not a way that I would be in normal life. I feel like I'm such a boring person in like when I'm not in that mode, the teaching mode.
Mhm.
I'm the person that's sort of like over that. I don't really talk that much. I'm such an unlikely person to have been called into the role I've been called into, but I love the feeling of stepping into that in front of a group of people, or I'll have the experience, even like like this podcast. I'm thinking, okay, what are we going to talk about? Oh, I don't really know anything about this. What would I say? I don't know. I mean, I've learned to not have that conversation in my head because it's happened so many times, but something gets switched, an opening, an amplification of presence happens that then allows words to come through me sometimes that I never would have thought I could speak, or, like the vibrations that come, like I was speaking to before. And it's really annoying when someone doesn't let go of that when they step off the stage.
Yeah, I was gonna say you get kind of you're very like in what's the word, insufferable.
Yeah, it's like, okay, we get it. We get
I
it.
know, Matt. Okay, Magic Man. You're like, trying to turn it off and just be a regular guy. Yeah, it's interesting. Like when I'm being interviewed, like I'm very similar. I don't talk a lot in my day-to-day life. I'm pretty quiet and very kind of like direct with my language and things like that. Um, my wife and I will have conversations in the kitchen, and she's into plant medicine and astrology and everything. So we have these really big open conversations where we can explore ideas and kind of test things out and like test verbalizing experiences and things like that. But like, yeah, when I'm getting interviewed on a podcast, um, I become so much more articulate
Yeah.
than I am in everyday life. And it's something about that space that opens up. And like I noticed in your body, you kind of like the spine straightened a little bit. And that's how I feel it too. Like something is calling me to attention and to presence. And I don't think about what I'm going to say. I say things in a way more articulate way than I could do outside of that context.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And so like I just want to be clear, like I think what we're talking about with persona isn't about putting on like a kind of a fake uh persona, but there's something about the ritual space that calls something forward in us that may not be called forward in other circumstances. So it's like I'm just showing another facet of who I am,
Yeah.
and it's a part that is really important to who I am. So if I don't have the opportunity to allow that to come
Mhm.
forward, I get well, I really miss it. First of all, I'm like, oh, I need some like I just need to do a circle or something. It's been too long. Um, and so I don't know if that's like the thing itself calling forward and going, come on, let's go. Like I need to be expressed through you.
Mhm.
Or if it's me just kind of loving the experience of that, and wanting to kind of be in that soup with people, where I don't have to think about anything. Something just happens and that's kind of wonderful and magical. Um, it's probably all of those things,
Yeah.
but just to be clear, it's not something I put on, but it's maybe something different that gets an opportunity to show itself or to express through me. That's how
Yeah.
I feel it.
Yeah. Totally. That's how I feel too. When you were talking, I was sort of feeling, like the muses, or whatever it is, your daimon, like kind of pushing, like, come on, let's go. And like I get
Mm.
that too. If I'm not don't have opportunity to do my thing, I start to get agitated, and I get grumpy, or
Crabby, yeah.
crabby, and it's like
Okay.
I gotta find some people there, there I had
I gotta get a circle together. I
yeah,
gotta round up some folks.
this one moment where I was like kind of just being period of time where I was just being a little bit too intense with my wife, like getting in this mode of like, this thing's out of order, and this and this and this. And this voice came as like, you need to get a group of men together. And so you can like bring that, real thing to like a men's group, but not, so you can leave your wife alone. It's too much for her.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's a good signal for me too when I start getting too kind of nitpicky about the way the house is being kept, or too many shoes on the rug, all that kind of shit. It's a good sign. Yeah, get thee to a circle, or organize something like actually useful, pal. I know there's
Yeah.
the urge to organize. That's great. Oh, I feel so seen.
Hmm.
But it's part of the thing, right? Like that we've been talking about from the start. It's like listening to these inner impulses and giving them respect, and trying to figure out like how to follow through in accordance with what's arising, and to find a good place for whatever that energy is. Like with the organizing kind of rigid mail order thing, there's a place for that, and it's probably not, in the kitchen,
No,
especially if your wife has a kind of different style, which
exactly.
mine does.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it feels like this persona, like a better, maybe not say it a better way, but a different way to explain it than like, yeah, putting something on is that it's an intensification of presence. And I like that word intensification. I got that from um Gebser, who has these like different like modes of consciousness that he writes about, and that to dispel the hierarchical, like, oh, these are levels of consciousness that are like attained in a successive manner. Instead, he talks about them being as intensifications of certain forms of consciousness. So they're not hierarchical. So there's like the mythic and the magic and the mental rational and then the integral, and that none of them are more important than the other. They all are part of the same continuum, but we intensify into those. And it feels like that's part of the persona thing, is it the intensification, which brings a deeper presence with what is. And for me, it just brings me to think about this, like we've been talking about, how do we know what we know? How do we make meaning? And one of the ways that I find that calls me so much to understand the world is this, what I would call like an epistemology of love, like knowing through love. And, like Wendell Berry wrote something like, how can we possibly know what we do not love? And how can we love what we do not know? And so bringing us into this different
Mm,
relationship with the world where and for me, love is maybe, I'm sure there's some kind of love that doesn't involve intensification of presence, but it feels like just being as present as possible is the feeling that I get when I feel love for something, whether it's another human or a place or a tree or a plant or an animal, a
mm,
rock, a mountain. And so that that persona, for me, comes when I'm doing the teaching, but it also comes for me when I'm uh, on the other side of the equation, which is the listening side, and
mhm,
being in presence with the teachers,
mhm.
the non-human teachers, the more than human teachers. Yeah.
Yeah. And like having the wherewithal to know when to shut up and receive.
Mhm.
Yeah. Th- that part of that quote was interesting. How can you know something and not love it? Um, Love is one of those really poverty-stricken words in the English language. It doesn't acknowledge all the different ways of loving, all the forms of loving, all the expressions of love. And so, like, we have to kind of add all these qualifiers to love in order to better articulate it, to give it more segments and joints and make it more kind of fuller and mobile. Um, but I had this experience, not in the Santo Daime, but down in Peru at one of these Shipibo houses. And it was what I what I conceptualized, or it was the way it was told to me. So I shouldn't make any qualifiers, but it was the to love like Christ, the kind of Christ consciousness. It showed me a whole nother level of love that I hadn't experienced before. And it was surprising to me actually, because it was a kind of emptiness. It was being completely empty of any kind of judgment or preference. It felt like a unconditional acceptance, which allowed for people's flaws, for darkness, for tragedy, for grief. So it wasn't just a joyful, blissful experience. It was like everything and kind of being okay with everything. And in that moment, I mean, it was like, oh, there's no conflict. When you're in this state of Christ-like love or whatever you want to call it, there's no conflict. Like, this is the answer, but good fucking luck bringing that into the world, but it gives me a kind of a touchstone for how it could be,
Yeah.
within myself. And you know, really hard to live up to, but having that touchstone gives me something to kind of check myself against when I get caught up in all the kind of personal stories stuff and all of that, when I'm taking things kind of too personally. I can like check myself on that and go, there's this other way to be right now,
Mhm.
you know. And even just the recognition of that, like the kind of resonance of that experience that happened years ago can shift something, and then I can I can drop something, some little petty thing that I've been holding on to. Yeah.
Yeah, I can feel what you're talking about. You just
Mm.
like evoked it into the field, which is so nice. I have had similar experiences, and eh, I I last year I had this experience. I've been working with like not personalizing things because I'm really good at that.
Me too.
Taking offense and
Those are our wounds speaking, though, I think,
yeah, and something that shifted for me that is through there's a plant called yellow pond lily that
Mhm.
is, a plant that not that many people know about. It grows up in like usually not sometimes in the lower lands, but in like lakes and ponds. And, it's kind of like a cousin of the lotus. It has like it's in the muck and
Mhm.
then brings forth these like beautiful yellow flowers.
Is it like what we call skunk cabbage up here?
No, but they're in the same, no, they're not in the same family, but there is some resonance between those two plants. But
Because
it's
those
it
can look like giant lilies
yeah, yeah,
often when they're flowering, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have that like hooded flower thing.
But yellow
Um,
pond lily.
Yellow pond lily, yeah. And it really helps clear out the second chakra, the lower, what we call the lower, I don't like to use the lower and higher aspects of, being, because that what I found is that as I've worked to clear out a lot of the stuff there, because there's so much unconscious material gets stored in that region of the body, because we're so repressed sexually in this culture, that when I've been inspired to have that be the center of my being, my energetic being, rather than my heart, which is how we're so trained in like the Western cultures. Like the heart is the
Well,
center. You have to be oriented
i-
from the heart.
in Western spiritual culture,
Western spiritual culture. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. You're right.
Yeah, so we go basically in Western culture,
Yeah,
we go from like the head, maybe make it to the heart, but we don't go past the heart because Christianity taught us to hate the lower chakras and the
yeah,
body and things like that.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. But when I get into that place, it frees up the heart from having to be like in the turmoil of everything.
Yeah.
And then I can just be in this sort of witness space where that like what you were describing is like I'm just there witnessing and I'm having nothing of my being is getting hooked into whatever's coming at me and I can just be present with it. It's such a it's such a liberating experience. And then the heart
Mhm.
can, coming back to Hillman, he talks about the heart being this like not our personal hearts where we're like, having our confessions of oh, my problems and my this and my that, but it's more of like opening to that imaginal realm and letting the gods speak, and move through us, anchored by this like lower held center. And then it just, yeah, it opens up a whole new wealth of understanding of what it means to be a human and how to be in relationship with other people and the rest of the world.
Yeah. That didn't happen to me until I was over 40. And the way I always thought of it, because I was also taught my yoga tradition was all about the heart. My teacher's path was called the Heart of Yoga. His guru, his book was The Yoga of Heart, and it was all about the heart, 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 and really important to go from the head to the heart. But it was kind of unstable in many ways. And then I had an experience working with tobacco. And this is after working with ayahuasca many times. And then I did a tobacco ceremony, drinking tobacco, having tobacco poured down my nose, like in like any way I could get it in, more tobacco juice. Uh, and it was so interesting because it opened up something down around the second chakra, just kind of below the navel, not quite the generative organs, but somewhere in between. I felt a space open up. And when that space opened up, I go, oh, that's where little Brian is. Little
Mm,
Brian who suffered sexual trauma and all of that stuff. Look, and I was in Peru, so it was Briancito, like little Brian. He's down there, and now I have a connection to him. And after that, every time I would drink ayahuasca, the ayahuasca went past my stomach down into this opening, this like kind of little cave that had opened up for me down in that area,
mm,
and was nourishing this wounded little boy who had been kind of like lost in the dark down there.
yeah,
Um, and I think it gave, like you're saying, gave my heart some deeper roots,
yeah,
that there needed to be some clearing happening there and whatever. But I started to change after that. I physically changed. My belly softened down there after that, after being kind of held tight for 40 plus years, And in our culture, it's like, well, tight abs and all of that, that's the thing you want, right? But then my belly softened and I had to kind of get used to that. Like, ooh, I don't know. I had all these preconceptions about soft belly. And I went on a whole exploration of the hara in
mm,
Japanese culture. And it
mm.
was like, never trust a man who doesn't have a soft belly, who's not centered in his hara. And so it helped me kind of get over some of my Western prejudices about men with soft bellies. And yeah, I mean, it really changed things, but it was a little kind of second chakra stuff, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. That's why it's. I say this. There's so much that we can learn if we don't just learn about stuff from what other people say and what books say, that we
Mhm,
actually experience the world ourselves and really, because it's so easy to get inured to a certain, into these grooves,
mhm,
and that's where I feel like having something like the plants, whether it is like overtly psychoactive, plants like iboga and ayahuasca and mushrooms, or like these other plants that work more subtly, it helps get us out of those grooves because they're inviting a whole nother way. And then we can see, oh, and I've learned more about being a human from plants than I ever could have from other humans.
mhm. Yeah.
Just
Well, it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes of Captain Beefheart. Um, and I'm gonna butcher it, but it goes something like, look at a dog to see how a man should be,
mm,
and like my dogs have taught me more about being a good human than
mm,
other humans have, and plants the same. Yeah, it's funny that, hey,
yeah.
like, because I think like um, we used to learn from the non-human world on how to be a human. What it meant to be a true human was someone who was a part of the whole and had teachers everywhere and learned from our environment to how to live in harmony with the environment. Um, So it's not really surprising if your mind has shifted already. It's like, well, of course, like the plants have learned how to live on this planet. They've been doing it better for way longer than we
Way.
ever have. So of course they should teach us how to live better on this planet, you know?
Yeah, it's an open question for me. I mean, I feel pretty clear about the answer, but I don't want to be too dogmatic that how we are as humans is because of plants that like literally taught us how to, function in different ways through our perceptive capacities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Have you ever worked with Iboga?
No, never felt that call.
It it it's very it's not like this for everybody. It's very striking in the way that when you work with that medicine, it so many people report, and this for me is like report a complete understanding of who I am and the way my psyche works, like in a different way than any other of these medicines. They all have their virtues. I would never put one above the other, but the
Mm,
iboga has this really amazing quality of being able to see exactly what is stopping you, getting in the way of you being more fully your authentic self,
mhm,
and then giving these, like when I had my one of my big main journeys with iboga, it was like I got put into the simulator. It was like, okay, here's what we're working with you. There's all these things that are keeping you from being fully present the world, and now we're going to put you in the situation. And then it's like showing me all these things. I'm interacting, I'm speaking, and I make a mistake, and it like back to the beginning, spins me
mhm,
around, makes me nauseous again, and it just understands the way humans operate internally so well. I can't. I have no doubt that somehow that was part of the origin of us being how we are as humans today.
mm.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe being so far from that, we're open to learning from plants is how we've gotten to where we're at in like kind of,
Mm.
broadly Western culture or, you know, um, I hate that term. I'm always trying to find a better way to say what I'm talking about. I would say maybe like modern civilized people in terms of
Techno.
civilization being separate from the
Yeah.
natural world. And, is we forgot how to be true humans. And then some of us, get called to the plants to try to remember that, what you say about Iboga kind of helping us recognize who we really are in our kind of uniqueness. When I hear people talk about Iboga as like a grandfather type plant, it's got the vibe of a grandfather. Uh,
Mm.
that totally makes sense to me with how you described it because like traditionally, um, you're too close to the father for him to really recognize and encourage who you are
Mm.
sometimes because you're too like enmeshed, he's projecting all his uh unlived dreams on you or his expectations on you and you're seeing him as some oppressive giant or whatever, right? You're too close. But like the role of the grandfathers and also maybe the, more broadly like the uncles in the community, the older males were to see you for who you are and who you're meant to be, to see your gifts and to bless them and to then find the right people to pair you up with in order to nurture those uh, gifts, um, and so not having kind of like true elders in most people in our culture, we don't have elders around. I didn't even really have grandfathers around, and even if they were around, they wouldn't have been kind of elders, they'd be
Mhm.
olders.
Right.
So we can seek out some of these plants that carry that and can help to bless our our uniqueness. it's kind of sad, but isn't it also wonderful that there's still the opportunity there because the plants are still around,
Yeah.
and the plants aren't getting caught up in our superficial materialistic culture. The plants are being plants.
Everywhere. Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah, I love that, the way you describe that. And that's, if one of the things that the plants have been really calling forth in me, and I'm not saying that I'm an elder, but like there's a process that's happening. And it's
Mhm.
part of that thing that you were describing before about that, that Christ-like consciousness of just like really holding a wide space for people to be who they are without having anything. And I find myself being able to step into that more and more in the various communities I'm part of and not get caught up in the dramas of the things and just be like, yeah, that's how it is. It's going to be okay. We're going to make it. And that's,
That's
yeah,
Bob being Bob.
yeah, it's Bob being Bob. And we really, it's easy to see how or experience how the lack of elders, you know, how much of our like societal disharmony and our anxiety and our depression is from, one, not being able to express who we fully are because, the society is kind of wrenching us into these things and diagnosing us into these categories, and then not having people who can actually see who we are
Mhm.
so that we can then step into that. I mean, the there's lots of negative projections going on that we talk about, but you mentioned earlier positive projection, and the positive projection of like action. I mean, as a teacher or facilitator, that's why I feel like my number one role is, doesn't matter what I'm saying, what I'm doing, my number one role is to create a space where people can feel comfortable stepping into who they are. And I can, sometimes I have to do a little teasing to help that come forth, but usually just having the spaciousness allows people to bring that forth. So we really, obviously we need elders and we need people who can hold space. And then we need to have initiatory practice because I think one of the main aspects, the main reasons for doing an initiation is to find our trust in the more than human, and then to be able to have reflected back to us from all those myriad, facets of the world, different aspects of ourselves that, like if I work with dogwood as a teacher, it reflects certain things back to me. If I work with juniper, it reflects other things back to me. So if I hang out with you, a different part comes out from me. So
Mhm.
in creating community where we can learn to trust each other enough to let those processes happen, even if they turn towards uncomfortability, which is where, of course, the real gems often lie.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I think of myself sometimes as an elder in training, and
Hmm.
that's a kind of a sense of obligation. Um, taking what I mourn for or I grieve for, the lack of not having elders in my life and in the wider community, seeking deeper meaning, seeking answers to why the world's so fucked up and how can we like find our way through it or out of it. Not finding a lot of people, older people in my community who can meet that call fills me with like sadness and grief. And so taking that sense of lack into like that becomes the calling in a way. The absence is something calling you into it. So yeah, elder in training, initiation absolutely essential because part of initiation, maybe the first part before we can open up to a broader perspective on who to learn from in our wider community, including the not merely human, is a kind of subverting of the tyrannical ego. And so that the breakdown, the shamanic dismemberment, the descent into the underworld, the being consumed by the the cosmic anaconda, however that kind of breakdown happens for you, it's totally essential. Like especially for us moderns, I mean, and that might take, you might have to take a number of cracks at it before it actually breaks up enough to allow something else in, or um, allow a kind of reformation in a new form of the sense of the self, the ego,
Mhm.
the I. Um, and yeah, I definitely, took enough poundings where that broke enough loose where I could be more fully myself. And then like the allowing other people thing. Um, as an elder, I think it's like not always just about like loving everyone in the usual sense. Um, like sometimes I think what's required is the ability to maintain like enough distance from people, kind
Mhm.
of energetically, psychically, emotionally, um, and like keeping that distance actually allows for authentic closeness,
Mhm.
if that makes sense. Because then when you're close, it's real. You're
Yeah.
not being a phony. And it's also about protecting yourself. Like I can accept that Bob is the way he is. It's not my job to change him. It doesn't mean I got to hang out with him.
Right.
He might be a very kind of bad person to hang out with.
Hmm.
So it's also like having strong boundaries and things. Like the strong boundaries is what creates the good container in a way. And it's just as much about what's inside the container as what's left outside of the container, right?
Yeah.
I mean, do you have the same feelings about that? Like,
Yeah. There's it kind of goes back into that kind of like where our orientation lies in the heart or other, maybe more of our whole beings. When it's
right.
in that heart, you get tied up in things and then you get caught up and there's this like that that doesn't serve it doesn't actually serve the harmonious expression of kind of like the relational field.
Hmm.
And we were having we have a little community here where I live that we're kind of figuring out how to organize ourselves and be with each other. And there's sort of people that are peripheral to what we're doing here. And we went through this whole process about how do we create boundaries so that what we're trying to do, which, in particular, like create spaces where we can be in really, there can be spaciousness and we can be more in like the subtle arenas of communication with each other. And then, there's some people that come and they don't quite match the vibe and just sort of like, "Blah, blah, 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 blah," and then
Hmm.
can't, can't do it. And so,
It usually has something to do with not being able to just shut up and be quiet.
yeah, there's like this anxiety running them. They're kind of like 2 feet ahead of where they need to be to actually be receiving. So they're not actually receiving them. Everything's out in front. It's my
Yeah.
experience.
Or
And
discomfort with quiet or space. Yeah.
yeah.
And I
And
get
so
that and I feel for that, but I don't necessarily want to be around that, especially when I'm trying to have a sauna or do something
totally,
else.
totally. So we had all these meetings. How are we going to deal with this? And what kind of boundaries can we put up? And then my wife said, what if we just like invite these people to be with us and we just like appreciate them and shower them with love? And I was like, I don't know about that. But we did it. We actually did it. And it felt really good to do that for someone because I'm really good at getting kind of like, because I like to protect my how I want to experience the world. And
Mm,
it's for most of my life I haven't been able to because the dominant culture is so loud and abrasive and doesn't really give space for that more sensitive interconnection.
mhm.
And so we did that with this in that context I was speaking of. And then the next day we were all together having tea. And the person who never really jived with what we were doing completely dropped into it.
Mm.
And then it made me really question this idea of like keeping these boundaries, that there's a wider space that I could hold it from, or we all together could.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean we're saying we want to hang out with you all the time, but like not having the something to push against, I think maybe creates the space for people to find where they um, can be in resonance. And if they're not, then they can just make the choice to not, you know, maybe that's a little idealistic, but I feel like there is something beyond, just creating boundaries that can really be on a whole other level of community that I'm in the midst of exploring. And as you can see, I'm sort of like
Yeah,
doubting
quite
myself even as I say it, but I did
sounding a
experience
little
this.
idealistic. I mean, you said it.
Yeah.
Um, but I think there's something important in what you just described. You know, my boundaries are limited by my capacity. Like it's really about my limitations to tolerate, someone who's not walking the way I walk or talking the way I talk or whatever it is. Um, and so I'm limited by my capacity. But I have to respect those boundaries because part of that is accepting my limitations. And I think that's a really important lesson to learn as a facilitator or as a human being. But when we're together with other people, like co-facilitating a space, our capacity increases, right? So the boundaries can open up more. So I think that's a beautiful teaching, like especially in a culture that you know tells us that we can be independent and self-sufficient and autonomous. You hear these words thrown around all the time. It's like, well, sure, but you're going to be living in a really uh, a small space.
Yeah.
But if you're kind of co-creating or co-facilitating with other people, that space can expand and include more people, more diversity. And isn't that wonderful? You know, like my wife, she's got a totally different kind of vibe than I do. I tend to be more kind of protective and like, and she's just like, she's very much more tolerant to people. She's been a hairdresser for like 25 years, so she works with all kinds of people in really intimate spaces and hears all stories. And she's got a lot more tolerance than I do. And so when just the two of us work together, all of a sudden I relax a little bit of my
Mhm.
stuff. And it's not all on me,
Yeah.
and I can kind of sit back and let Debbie take over. And isn't that nice too, So I
Mhm.
think it's like the power of working together expands our capacities, you know?
Yeah. And I like how you said being a facilitator, being a human being. And I
Mhm.
teach this course on holding space. And through doing that, I realized, oh, holding space is just being human. We're always doing that. We're just doing it different ways, and bringing awareness to how do we hold space. Not that we're going around with our persona on all the time, but the persona helps be more tolerant too. But also
Mhm.
just like holding space for whatever, whether it's other people or for the trees out there. But it brings out a different capacity of being human that I think so many of us are learning about. And I love how you're saying how we co-facilitate. And then there's, I'm being in spaces now where it's not like there's one or two facilitators, that everybody is in that, the role is held very lightly and it can shift. So one person can more step into it, or we can all be doing it together. It's really uh, opens up a lot of potentiality.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I really have enjoyed where the conversation has taken us. Um, I have a bunch of stuff here about particular plants and things like that, but I really like the way our conversation integrated working with plants and being a person and working
Mhm.
with people and things like that. Um, it all all makes sense to me. I couldn't
Yep.
really, like we were talking about earlier, I'm not going to be able to maybe write, it'll take me a while to write a description of this episode when I try
Mhm.
to entice people to come listen to it because I think there's a lot of good medicine here. Um, but that's okay. Um, let's finish up. It's getting to be an hour and a half. Um, if you could just tell people a little bit about what you're currently offering
Mm.
online or in person.
I run a school called the School of Forest Medicine that is based around all what I've been talking about. That's how we learn. I go out into the forest, the desert, and so I do a trip. I used to do many trips, but now I do one trip a year, the High Desert Odyssey. That's happened in September. And then I'll have uh
Sorry, high desert in Oregon?
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
way in Southeast Oregon. And that's a
Yeah,
whole
I mean I had a really amazing Santo Daime work out there in a crater.
oh yeah. I've never been to that one, but I've heard
Oh
good stuff.
boy.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I've been to the high desert. It's beautiful there.
Yeah. And then I have some online courses that are like botanical allies for becoming better humans. I do a one-on-one mentorship program with people to kind of help, you know, hold a space for people to become what they're becoming. And then I have a reciprocal illumination, all kinds of different courses. And I just finished doing this Kickstarter for this regenerative wildcrafting course, which is something, I spent, you know, almost 30 years practicing wildcrafting, harvesting medicinal plants and making medicine from them. And I put together, in the process of putting together a course, it'll be ready to go in the fall, with these really beautifully produced videos and that like kind of like show the care that goes into harvesting the plants and all of that. And there'll be a whole course so that when you do that, you'll know what you're doing. I also have a book, Pacific Northwest Medicinal Plants. If people want to kind of check into like more of like the herbal medicine aspects, it's tinged with the more like energetic psychospiritual stuff too. And people that read it go, oh, there's something more in here, and they'll kind of entice them to dive deeper.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and then there's uh, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. There's
Yeah. Just
the
go to
web,
his website. I'll put a link down
yeah,
there
go to the
and
website.
because you got like personal kind of consultation, spiritual consultations that you do and things like that. I mean, there's so much that we didn't talk about. The whole area of singing to the plants, with the plants, for the plants.
Yeah.
That's an area that I've been it's been a big part of my life, and Santo Daime really opened me up to
Mm.
that, and healed like a lot of the wounds I had around singing.
Mm.
Beautiful. Uh, and also, I wanted to talk to you about how working with plants of our local place can help us decolonize or re-indigenize, how maybe both those things have to happen. Um, and also, like, I was asking Debbie over dinner, like, because she's actually studying to get her herbalism license. So she's going from being a folk herbalist to more of a kind of
Mm.
professional practitioner, which is really cool. So I was like, what would you ask a herbalist who's been doing it for a while? And we got into this whole discussion about um, so-called invasive species
Mm.
and the ones who adapt. Like, can they teach us kind of displaced people how to live in better harmony with the place and peoples of this land? And I mean, I think there's a whole fascinating conversation there. Yeah.
Definitely. Oh yeah, I could say a lot about that.
Oh, well, can we do it again and we'll just do it like a part two?
Oh man, I would love to. I
Great.
so appreciated connecting with you and just yeah, like what came just from us being together and being open to what wanted to arrive. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a great conversation, and it talked a lot about what you do in your work and at your school without giving the kind of the brochure presentation.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, it's
I'm
like
not good at the brochure
Scott's
presentation.
Scott's living it, and this is kind of what it looks and feels like. So
Yes.
I mean, I think it did a better job of addressing those things point by point.
Totally.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate it, man. It's been really nice to talk to you, and we'll see you down the road sometime soon. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Likewise, I really appreciate it, and I hope we get to connect more.
Great. Take care, man.
You too.
Ciao.
Bye.